Welcome to this panel.
Okay, we're gonna start in 5, 4. It's the teacher in me. 3, 2, and 1. Thank you. Thank you for your attention up here. Just teasing her. All right. So thank you, everybody. Welcome back. This will be our final panel of speakers for the day. And I would first like to introduce Dr. Nathalie Kermoal. Nathalie Kermoal is a full professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Ottawa. Nathalie has published 3 books and numerous articles in academic journal and collective volumes. Her research interests include Métis issues, Canadian Aboriginal constitutional issues, urban Indigenous history, and Indigenous women's issues. From 2011 to 2012, she was interim dean at the Faculty of Native Studies. From 2013 to 14, she was special advisor on Aboriginal academic programs with the Faculty of Native Studies. And since January of 2016, Nathalie has been, I'm going to say our director, or the director, of the Rupert Sand Centre for Métis Research at the Faculty of Native Studies. Please welcome Nathalie. All right, that's good. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Tara Joly, who, no, I'm not. I'm going to introduce Almer, Waniandy. Hope I got that right. Almer Waniandy is a McMurray Métis elder who was born and raised in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and grew up at Moccasin Flats. In his younger years, Almer ran dog teams on the Athabasca River, delivering supplies to trappers. Almer is retired from the Construction and General Workers Union, Local 92, where he worked at numerous oil sands plants around Fort McMurray. He now lives in Edmonton and visits Fort McMurray regularly. Please welcome Almer. Woo! All right. He traveled a long way. And I'm just going to say this. I just found out that he's actually grew up with my father, Jackson Couture. So it's nice to meet you, Almer. All right. And finally, we have Tara Joly. Tara is a research director at Willow Springs Strategic Solutions, Incorporated. Joly is an environmental anthropologist whose research examines human-environment relations and epistemological encounters in northern Alberta. I don't think I said that right. Epistemological. Epistemological. Is that right, Paul? Okay. He's giving me the thumbs up. She has also worked on a wide range of research projects related to Indigenous rights in the circumpolar north. She works closely with Indigenous communities, including the Fort McMurray Métis, to plan and conduct community-based research projects, environmental monitoring and research, land use, mapping studies, and oral history, and ethnographic research. Wow. Joly holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Aberdeen and was formerly a postdoctoral fellow in anthropology at the University of Saskatchewan. Please welcome Tara. Okay. So we're going to start with Dr. Kermoal.
Okay. So around this time, it's usually not always the best time to talk because people are digesting. So, so I'll try to be as dynamic as I can be in order to present this presentation. So first of all, I'd like to say that I responded to a call from Audrey, who asked me to do this presentation. And I have to say, at first, I have a tendency to say, "Oh yeah," and then there's work that is involved, and then. But I have to say, I had a lot of pleasure, even though it's hard history, to prepare this presentation. So what I tried to do is, first of all, what I'll try to do is to give you the context in how Saint-Paul-des-Métis came to be, and then I'll look at land use, and then I will be looking at the trafficking of land. So that's mainly what I'm going to try to do in the next 25 minutes. Okay, so here you have Father Lacombe, who in 1895 decided to develop a plan for a large Métis reserve. And in this sense, you have to forget the idea of reserve like an Indian reserve, like it's a bit different, and I'll explain as we go forward. A plan for a large Métis reserve to be granted by the federal government. So there was a reasoning behind this creation of this colony. I'll use the term colony also. And this is annoying because it's changing on its own. It has its own life. So first of all, it was mainly to alleviate social breakdown. And Leah mentioned that when she did her presentation of dispossession, and especially after 1885, after Batoche. And also, he proposed the plan as an alternative to Scrip. So, Father Lacombe, in 1891, so I did a lot of research on his writing, and he writes often to his bishop. I guess that's normal for a priest, and to Bishop Grandin, and he indicates that he worries about the future of the Métis, and he stresses the bad influences of white people, and mainly, when it comes to the future of the Métis, there's a lot of things that are changing, especially what we call Alberta today, in the sense that there's hunting laws and fishing laws that are being passed, and they are restricting people into their movement and into their abilities of either hunting or fishing, depending. So that means that people end up being in some difficult situations, some famines, and he reiterates his worries to his bishop, in January 1895, and he adds that there are a number or numerous famines around Edmonton and Calgary and Lethbridge and Fort Macleod that live difficult lives, and he says that those lives are more difficult than the First Nations at the time. He also mentions families that are living in Montana, Métis families that are living in Montana, and of course he's a priest. So nomadism is not his favorite word. And he wants to settle people down, and he wants to call upon the Métis that are living in Montana to bring them north and eventually settle somewhere in Alberta in order to be able to have influence on them. At the same time, and you have to look at the larger history also, the Catholic Church was very worried about what the Protestants were doing. They were their competition. So they were running some kind of a marathon together, and they didn't know exactly who was going to win. And so he was worried mainly around education. And he was hoping that the Catholic Church would have, would manage to be the chosen one by the government to lead educational projects. The thing is, when we look at the alternative to Scrip, Lacombe in his writing, and it's true throughout the 1880s, throughout the 1890s, he denounces Scrip. he really sees the cupidity of the Scrip speculators, and he tells the story in newspapers. So this is one excerpt. And for him, something needed to be done. So he will come up with a plan to gradually transform Métis individuals into farmers. And, sorry, this is annoying, but at first, and this links to what Keisha told us, he thought of Buffalo Lake. Yeah, the one close to Red Deer. And he thought, well, this would be a good place to go, but in the end decided not to go that way, mainly because there were too many white people. And he wanted to find a community or a place where people had too much contact with white people in order to be able to do what he wanted to do with the Métis family. So he decided to go northeast, and he chose the area of Saint-Paul-des-Métis. What's interesting is that when we look at Sawchuk and Ferguson, who wrote this book in 1981 that Frank mentioned in his presentation, it seems that the government at the time didn't really have any idea of any alternative to Scrip. It felt it had fulfilled most of its obligations, but the government was worried about a couple of things, though. It was worried about the impoverishment of the Métis people. Why? Mainly because it felt that, well, if the Métis are discontent, then they could do what they did in Batoche again. So they didn't like that. And then there was also the fact that, well, they didn't want to address the real cause of the impoverishment of the Métis people, like the losses in Batoche, the fact that there was Scrip fraud, and also the fact that there were some changes, economic structures that made people poorer. So they thought, the government, I shouldn't say they, but the government, agreed with Lacombe's plan and saw this as a possible alternative from Scrip. And they thought, well, it would be an easy solution that didn't require too much money. It didn't require too much policy changes to remedy the problem of the impoverishment of Métis people. So they also saw the religion as being the mediation that would take care of some of the issues by correcting certain tendencies that supposedly Métis people had, such as improvidence, I insist on this, improvidence, and nomadism. I'll come back to this. However, even though Lacombe had this plan, there was also the fact that the commissions continued throughout 1885, as we heard. So Lacombe's proposal was very paternalistic in its title, a philanthropic plan to redeem, I insist on the redemption, the half-breeds of Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. So it was accepted by the government. And then on December 28th, 1895, there was an order in council that was passed and established Saint-Paul-des-Métis on a 21-year lease. So that's the story. So once that was done, then there were a number of townships that were created, and there were some sections of land that were kept for the church, and the government allotted $2,000 to buy seed grain and implements, and then the Métis were supposed to become self-sufficient agrarian. And then the structure, when we look at the structure of Saint-Paul-des-Métis per se, well, there was not much Métis governance in there. It was mainly, the clerics that were, looking over this specific colony. So Lacombe was busy doing all kinds of different things, so he asked Adéodat Terrien, who was also a priest, and the first time I saw his his picture, I wanted to run away. So he was, well, he's a bit scary. So Adéo d'Aterrien was put in charge in the colony, and he believed that the residents were to live by the fruit of their labors and not expect the colony to support them like Indians on a reserve. But what's interesting, in 1924, when he ends up in Saskatchewan, because, they're pushed away and then they're placed somewhere else, for a region, Onion Lake, he says that, people should have been put into reserve, like Indian reserve, with agents, instructors, residential schools to initiate them to agriculture and sedentary life. So I guess one changes its mind very quickly. But I think in part this has to do with what happened in Saint-Paul. So Lacombe does not waste any time. He puts ads in newspapers, in Cree, in French, and in English. And then when we look at Scrip applications, we can tell that those are from 1900, that some of the people that are going to St. Paul were actually from Edmonton, St. Albert area, from Battle River, Duhamel area, Fort Pitt, Battleford region. Some had withdrawn from treaty, and some families came from Montana. So of course, it would be very important to actually try to do a very in-depth study of these Scrip applications, but nobody has done that yet. So each family was supposed to receive first 40 acres of land, but an ordinance council increased the size of 80 acres in 1896. Then there was livestock, agricultural equipment, access to hay, grazing, and woodcutting that was supposed to be part of that. And then what we're seeing is that the first year there were 30 families. Then we go to 1904, 80 families, but by 1908, there were 63 families in Saint-Paul-des-Métis. In 1899, the Grey Nuns established a boarding school, and then the kids are going to put it on fire in 1905. I'll come back to this. So this is a map. Well, sorry. This is a map of St. Paul, and we see the names of some of the people. I don't know, you might not see that well. But the thing is, what you have to realize is that by 1908, the Métis leases were terminated. And 2 years later, the colony was opened to French Canadians. And the original Métis settlers of Saint-Paul-des-Métis, of course, were really upset about that and sent a petition to Ottawa. This petition hasn't been found. We looked at it. So I know somebody from the archives. If you have it, please forward it to us. And if somebody has it somewhere, let us know. But despite the request, the French-Canadian settlers came and caused many Métis people to leave the region. So this is the story, okay, in a nutshell. But let's look at the land use, because I think that's very important. And I base some of my, what I'm going to say on what Jim Brady said when he wrote regarding the St. Paul half-breed reserve. And he said, opponents stated that the reserve had been terminated because the Métis failed to become self-supporting. But when we look at evidences, it doesn't really look that way. First of all, I'm always shocked when I read about St. Paul by the fact that we have the impression that there were no Métis families that were living in that area before even the reserve was open, which is not true, of course. There were like a lot of Métis free traders that were living in the region way before St. Paul was created, and the Desjardins and the Cardinal were living in that area. And also, it's a region that is renowned for its good fishing. for its good hunting and for its trapping. And actually, Father Lacombe, when he writes about Saint-Paul, the Saint-Paul area, he talks about an oasis. Also, according to Brady and Adrian Hope, Saint-Paul got its name from Saint Paul Cardinal, who in 1884 erected a cabin. It was known as Saint Paul's Place among early Métis in the region. And also, when we look at the correspondence of Father Lacombe, he does mention, when he's still writing to his bishop, he does mention that actually there were already a number of families that were living in that area, and that these families were planning on staying there and continuing on living in the area. Also, what we find when we look at evidences, and I will connect with what Alice said earlier about the corridors, what we're seeing is that Saint-Paul-des-Métis people were actually traveling back and forth to Wolf Lake, which was for a while a wintering camp, for hunting and trapping, but also for whitefish. And when we look at the correspondence of Father Terrien, he does talk about the fact that he's encouraging the Métis people to go to Wolf Lake, to Lac du Loup, Wolf Lake, in order to go fishing on fishing expeditions. And he does that regularly with people, so then people can prepare food for the winter. Also, in his report, Routin, who was agent of the Dominion's land in Edmonton, a report that he wrote in 1899, he says that there's a lot of pike, abundance of pike in the area, that there's a lot of timbered land for construction and fencing, that the soil, and I underlined, of excellent quality, and that's important because that's what will attract, to open Saint-Paul for general settlement, and that the Métis had under cultivation 363 acres, and that they were cultivating wheat, barley, oats, and they also had gardens, like vegetable and potato gardens. We also know that there were some pigs, and that Terrien brought the pigs and then exchanged that with the inhabitants in order to get free labor. And that they had plows and harrows and disc and binder and mower, and that they were building in 1899, they were actually 1898 when the agent came, they were building a grist mill in order to be more self-sufficient. But he does say that farm implements are missing to cultivate more, and that in the next years it will be important for the colony to have more farm implements. Also, if we look at some of the oral history, according to Joe Collins, who came from Montana, the land was rich, plenty of ducks, the water unspoiled. Trees were cut to make log houses. It was hard work since there were no saws. First, we live in tents, 7 families. It took us 1 week to set up log houses, barns, and fences. We know also that there were freighting activities that were happening between Vegreville and Edmonton, and that some of the families, the Métis families that were living in the area, were also working for surveyors like Marshall Hopkins, and they would receive a salary of $50, $40, or $35 depending on their skills. There is also Adrian Hope, who mentions that, how people were working the land and how they were breaking the land and how they were building the houses, and also mentions that these people were also building the church and ended up building the boarding school. So that's a lot of work, and some of it was not recognized, obviously. And he continues and mentions that they ceded 10 acres plots that they had broken. And Brady adds that some of the families had cattle and horses. And when you look at the numbers, I don't know if you can see them, I can't even see them on my, but in some cases people had like 1,300 head of cattle. That's a lot. Well, it seems to me, like I'm not a rancher of any kind, but I mean, And the same with horses, and so some of the families, the Laframboise and the Garneau and the Poitras, had quite a lot of cattle and horses, and some of them had trading posts. A document signed by Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier in 1899 also concludes that the efforts made by the trustee, so the trustee is the Catholic Church, have been successful. So, obviously in 1899, even Wilfrid Laurier thought that the colony was doing okay. But the thing is, things start to change, so when you read the correspondence, when you read some of the documents in the archives, you realize that, people are always trying to find the failings of the Métis, and will bring that out as soon as something is not going well. And in 1904, we know that there was a crop failure, but that's nobody's fault, it just happened. But what will come out very quickly is that as we move forward, and especially starting in 1904 to the opening of the colony to general settlement, what we're seeing is that, there's a lot of things that irregularities, or as Frank mentioned this morning, what we call sharp dealings. So we know from Brady that there were two issues, the railroad, but that's not new, and also the penetration of settlers in contiguous territory. But what is interesting is when you start reading some of the archival documentation, especially the correspondence between, the clergy and the government, what we're seeing is that the squatters were handled in a rather soft manner, which I find really interesting because when we look at specific areas where Métis squatted, they were not, dealt with in a soft manner. So there's two standards, double standards. So the problem appeared in 1904 when a Charles Tremblay had entered and squatted on the boundary of the reserve. And there's other documents, affidavits, that are showing that other people did the same thing. But in Tremblay's case, Norquay was a land agent in Edmonton, writes to the Ministry of Interior to ask if the land can be taken as a homestead. The response was from the Ministry of Interior that it can't satisfy the desire of the squatters, but if the syndicate agrees, the men could stay. The burning of the school also precipitated the idea of transforming the colony, and the person who championed that was Terrien, the Father Terrien, who convinced Frank Oliver, he's everywhere, obviously, we heard that he was in Edmonton earlier, so was at the time Minister of the Interior in 1905, to survey around the colony and open the area for homestead. But also, Terrien actually encouraged people to take homestead outside the colony, and it seems that eventually he used the evidence that the Métis used the evidence of the fact that some of the Métis moved out of the reserve to take homestead outside, and he used that evidence to tell the government that the Métis were no more interested in the colony. So, talk about sharp dealings. On several occasions, Oliver was informed by Métis settlers that people were squatting on land, such as a man named Fouquet, and he had fenced off 2 sections of colony land. So, there was some writing with Oliver, and Oliver said, well, at first, he didn't want to give this guy another 160 acres, but that that nothing would be, they would do nothing. They would not ask Fouquet to leave. So it's like, whatever, he can stay, even though he's squatting on this reserve. Another correspondence so what you have to realize is that by 1805, 1806, it's quite clear that there's rumors that this colony is going to be open to general settlement. And the Métis, of course, heard about those rumors, of course. So they write to the Ministry of the Interior, Oliver, and ask what's going on, let us know. And as was said earlier, as Frank said, and also Jason, people were asking questions and demanded answers. And Oliver said in 1907, no, there's no provision that has been made to open the colony. But then by August 11, 1908, an order in council requests the termination of the Métis leases on the land. But the minister says, okay, we're going to close we're going to open the colony, but before, what we need to do is to make sure that we look at the claims of the Métis people. So they sent a guy named Samuel Maber, and in his report, he notes that 63 families had legitimate claims. And it says 20 heads of families settled on 80 acres and received patent for homestead elsewhere. 28 others had 80 acres but had not exhausted their homestead right, eligible to 160 acres of land, and 15 were holding entries for homestead outside of the reserve. He declared that 19 were not residents and had no right for consideration. And most of these people, the 19 people, were unmarried sons that were living with their fathers or elderly fathers who were living with their son. So that meant that in the end, or even sometimes in some cases, people were away, and the wife was away, and then when they came back, they had no claim anymore for their land. And so ultimately they were denied, even though they had resided in the area, they were denied residence. In April 10th, 1909, the reserve is open to settlement, and then French Canadians people line up in the Dominion Land Office in Edmonton. And what's interesting is that some of these families had been informed by terrien that there were land available and that each settler was allotted a number which matched the homestead location on a list. And they said Oliver had one of his employees there, and he sent that employee to the land office in Edmonton. So obviously something happened there, that there was some trafficking, that there was some irregularities that were happening. And the fact also that the tactic clearly blocked individuals whose claim had been disallowed from making entries as well. What we know also, at the moment that it's open to the general settlement, is that there's some dealings that are happening where some Métis that were illiterate were being used in order to get their land. And so there's a lot of that going on, but what we know from histories that have been written in the past, some of the documents have disappeared. According to Ken Hatt, who's an historian, who wrote a paper on Saint-Paul, the government knew that trafficking was happening and needed to be rectified. There was, however, ambiguity on how to treat the Métis land. On the one hand, the land were considered as a special grant, and on the other, homesteading duties were required before patent could be received. And there's ample evidence to know that to see that the government doesn't really know what to do with those lands. So in conclusion, in an interview, Richard Poitras mentions that Frenchmen came in as a flock, not a trickle, but a big flock. The arrival of new settlers brought further difficulties tied to blatant discrimination and racism. Métis families had a hard time to compete with French Canadians' families because most of them couldn't get money from banks, so they had a disadvantage. And it pushed many families away from Saint-Paul-des-Métis towards northern Alberta, towards Lesser Slave Lake and Fishing Lake area. And when we look at the dealings at what happened around Saint-Paul-des-Métis, it's very clear that there was paternalism, patronage, secrecy. We talked a lot about secrecy and earlier this morning, but it's very clear in the case of Saint-Paul, and trafficking were at the center of Saint-Paul-des-Métis experiment and experience. There is ample evidence that the Métis developed this colony and gave a lot of free labor to the church. It is also quite clear that the land granted to Métis settlers were never clearly defined. As Sawchuk and Ferguson noted, the rationale in opening the colony was that the Métis needed protection from the competitiveness of colonists. Upon the closing of the colony, they needed to be integrated with the European colonists and imbued with their competitive spirit. So it's like being stuck between those two ideas, and it doesn't give much opportunities for people ultimately. And the last result is that most of the families left Saint-Paul-des-Métis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nathalie Como. We'll now hear from, is it both at the same time? Both Dr. Tara Joly and Almer, talking about the Moccasin Flats evictions in Fort McMurray. Thank you. I think, pardon? So just respectfully, we're just being directed to wait and have our questions when Dr. Tara Joly and Almer are finished, and we'll have about half an hour or so for more questions. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Tara Joly, and I'll be presenting with Almer Waniandy on behalf of myself and also my research partner, Hereward Longley, who couldn't make it today. But this was very much a collaborative work with him as well. And he's working with this story further in his PhD thesis here at the U of A in history. In April 2018, the Fort McMurray Métis Local 1935 tasked us with writing a report about the history of the evictions of Métis people at an area called Moccasin Flats in downtown Fort McMurray. So today we'll be talking about the importance of the place and the story of the evictions. We want to extend thanks to the elders we spoke to for sharing their stories, and especially acknowledge that some of those family members will be watching today online. So thank you for being with us today. We'd also like to thank Bill Ludit, who's here in the audience, who's the McMurray Métis CEO, for bringing this story forwards and for his ongoing advocacy on behalf of the families in his community. So thank you. Before I begin getting into the presentation of the research, I wanted to ask Almer to say a few words.
It's me again. All right, I just want to make something clear. I did not live right on Moccasin Flats. I stayed on the edge of Moccasin Flats, but I did do my little snaring of rabbits and everything else along the river of the Snai. And I watched the people that came in from different places like Fort Chipewyan and Fort Mackay. They came in they spent the summer there on the riverbanks on Moccasin Flats, and there was quite a few of them. And they came together as a family. I mean, from Fort Chip, it's been a long trip for them to come up river because the river is pushing them backwards, and they're traveling pretty hard to get up here. But they made it to Fort McMurray, and they joined with Fort Mackay, and they put their tents, and they had the little houses alongside the riverbank there, and all of a sudden they were asked to leave. I mean, that was kind of sad because there were so many of them. They were all like family. And myself, I used to go down there, and I didn't know how to speak the language, but it seemed like I just blended right in because they took me in just like one of their own. And I grew up with the young guys there, and they used to ask me later on, they said, "How did we ever get along? You never spoke Chip. You never spoke Cree." And I said, "Well, I don't know, but we sure made a day of it because we used to fish and swim and, hunt these little rabbits and stuff like that. And I used to haul water from the Snai and fill up my water barrel at home, and this was my job. I mean, Dad gives you a job of getting the wood supply and everything for Mom there, and you get it done, and there's no talking back, right? So this is how I learned to survive. And then after all that happened, I see these people getting pulled out of there, and I mean, it was kind of a sad deal because you miss your friends and everything else, and then you see them getting bulldozed over, and it was sad. It was very sad. I didn't know who had the right to do that to them, but they deserve to have something paid back to them for that because, I mean, it hurt lots of families. I mean, very lots of them. Very, very lots of friends. I mean, it was so sad. I'm telling you, it's hard to talk about. But anyhow, I wish them the best, and I wish you guys the best on your trip home because it's bad on the roads. The highways are bad right now, and I just wish you guys a safe journey home, and I'm happy that you allowed me to come and speak a little bit here. And I got a chance to find out a little bit more about my family because I met someone here who's going to give me a little bit more information, and I love it. This is what it's about, coming together and try to, help each other out and find a way to get through this. I'm sure we can, join together and have one big family here and bring things together and know how to get it done. And you guys can do it. And I thank you for having me here today. Hi, hi.
Thanks, Almer, for opening us off and getting us started on the right foot. So in this research, we describe Moccasin Flats as a predominantly Métis settlement along the southern bank of the Snai at its confluence with the Athabasca River. Our research does not preclude other ties that communities had to the area. Between 1975 and 1981, the new town of Fort McMurray collaborated with Northward Developments Limited, the housing arm of Syncrude, to evict Métis families at Moccasin Flats to build the Syncrude Towers, which is a housing tower, or was a housing tower for Syncrude workers, as well as a proposed marina which was never built. By calling Moccasin Flats residents squatters, the town used property law to justify their eviction and ignored the Indigenous identity, history, and rights of the residents. The evictions fragmented the Moccasin Flats community. It also disrupted people's relationships to the land, had cultural and socioeconomic impacts, and has been a source of intergenerational trauma. The evictions at Moccasin Flats were one of many forced relocations of Métis and First Nations people in Fort McMurray from the 1960s to the 1980s. This map shows how Moccasin Flats, which is highlighted in light red, spanned two pieces of land, which are both highlighted in gray: the Clearwater Drive Municipal Road Allowance and River Lot 5, which is the lot where Northward built the Syncrude Towers. Moccasin Flats was a road allowance community. This term originated to describe the Métis communities that settled on road allowances after being driven from their land following the suppression of the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. Without reserve land or anywhere safe to go, many Métis families settled on road allowances, the 66-foot wide strips of land set aside for roads by Crown surveyors for future road development. Métis families who built homes on road allowances lived in uncertainty, never safe from the possibility of being evicted once more to make way for development. Although road allowance communities are commonly thought of as occurring solely on the prairies in the early 20th century, the history of Moccasin Flats shows that road allowance communities occurred in the Canadian North and persisted into the 1980s. As the town rapidly expanded during the development of the oil sands industry, Moccasin Flats became a place of refuge for people who were driven out of other parts of Fort McMurray. Oral history collected for this study tells us that Moccasin Flats was a significant part of the Métis homeland. Neil Slangevin put it this way: "To them, the wooden structures and the tents there were their home. I kind of felt that way about my tent, my little home." Moccasin Flats was not a shanty town or full of squatters, as it was commonly depicted in the media at the time. The elders we interviewed told us that Moccasin Flats was their home, a place where families maintained relationships to each other and the land, and reproduced a cultural way of life. Elders told us that Indigenous peoples have lived at Moccasin Flats since time immemorial. There are few written records of the site until the 1970s evictions. However, the Fort McMurray Hudson's Bay Company post journals make one mention of a shanty point near the fort on June 10, 1884, and this was likely referring to Moccasin Flats. This point would have been a stopping place for trappers selling their furs, like Métis guides and trappers. The majority of the history of Moccasin Flats then comes from oral accounts. As Cameron MacDonald explained, by the 1800s, quote, already then we're talking about Moccasin Flats being settled, and some people stayed there all year long. In interviews, elders described that by the early 1900s, First Nations families such as from Fort McKay, as well as Métis families from along the Athabasca River, would travel to Fort McMurray and make Moccasin Flats their home in the summers, before returning to their traplines in the winter. Over time, the seasonal home would develop into a more permanent, predominantly Métis settlement, but the timing of this is unclear. However, Clark et al. Document in their research how the more permanent community around Fort McMurray was primarily Métis by the early 1900s. And this map here with the hand-drawn teepee at Moccasin Flats shows that even in some land planning documents, the site was recognized as an informal settlement. Elders we interviewed recalled that in their lifetimes from approximately the 1940s to 1970s, Moccasin Flats was a close-knit community. It was a place for people to make a home for a season or for life. Surnames of families that lived in Moccasin Flats arose from archival documents and oral history. So this list should not be read as complete, but rather a starting point for a larger genealogical study of the families who called Moccasin Flats home. An anonymous elder explained that, you know where the dike is? There used to be tents there all the way to waterways. People used to live along the river in the summertime. Oral history interviews suggested that there were about 10 to 30 tents along the Snai in the summers. And these summer residents of Moccasin Flats would work jobs on the riverboats, in town at local stores, with city service, or in construction. Elders also recalled joyful memories of living at Moccasin Flats where, quote, everybody got along. There was a strong sense of community. Social ties were strengthened through activities such as playing card games, sharing food, trading goods, and visiting each other. And yeah, there's a picture here of Almer as a child that he provided us. And he told us that Moccasin Flats was where you met a lot of people, a lot of elders. They had stories to tell just like everybody else, and they got along. And this storytelling is importantly a collective means of forming Métis knowledge and carrying on a Métis way of life. Moccasin Flats was also a center for Métis land use. Families would carry out land use activities at Moccasin Flats itself, such as setting snares for rabbits and foxes. With access to both the Clearwater and Athabasca rivers, Moccasin Flats was also an ideal place to stage hunting, trapping, fishing, and plant gathering expeditions. The land use and occupancy of the Moccasin Flats families blankets government trapline maps dating to the 1950s. So the map on the slide shows traplines held by Moccasin Flats families at that time. These trap lines were not only areas in which families made a living by trapping fur-bearing animals, but they were also key Métis spaces where families could maintain their way of life. So now that we've established the importance of the site itself, I'll discuss the story of the evictions. The Moccasin Flats evictions are a window into how colonialism works in Canada. It's a complex legal and political process in which governments and industry have forced Indigenous communities to forfeit their traditional homes. The town's first effort to evict the Snai families occurred when the town proposed to build a sewer line through the Clearwater Drive road allowance in 1975. The town held meetings with the Métis Association of Alberta and the Métis local and the provincial government. The Métis recommended that the road allowance be surveyed into lots and the land given to the Moccasin Flats residents, so they will be, quote, integrated into the community of Fort McMurray without suffering the ignominy which has so often befallen our people, end quote. While the sewer line was the official reason the town sought the eviction, Northward was planning to build Syncrude towers and asked the provincial government to evict the families. We thank Mr. John Malcolm, who provided us with a copy of the original Northward letter on the slide. On February 25th, 1976, Northward wrote to Bob Bogle, the minister responsible for Native Affairs, saying, quote, "The major problem is not the location of the sanitary sewer, but rather the inability to solve the problem of the squatters. We feel that if the town succeeds in expropriation, a major incentive to deal with the problem will have been removed. We urgently solicit the cooperation of your department in dealing with the problem," end quote. An internal letter from Lorne Mowers at the Department of Indian Affairs to F.J. Watchley, Director General of Indian Affairs for Alberta, stated that, quote, "If necessary, Syncrude is prepared to expropriate the area of squatters and bulldoze the homes." In response to Northward, Alberta Minister for Native Affairs Bob Bogle wrote to Northward VP JPC Elson to say that the province would not evict the Moccasin Flats residents, saying, quote, "It should be understood by all parties involved that I, as Minister of Native Affairs, do not and will not support any form of forceful eviction of the inhabitants of the area in and around the Snai River." The province instead offered to pay for relocation and told the town that it was responsible for giving land to Moccasin Flats families. So like I said, Moccasin Flats spanned two pieces of land, River Lot 5 and the Clearwater Drive road allowance, which is along the river there. In 1977, Northward moved to buy River Lot 5 to prepare for building Syncrude towers. The owners convinced several families living on River Lot 5 to move their houses to the road allowance. Some families living on the river lot may have had adverse possession or squatters' rights claims to that land. In Alberta law, if someone can demonstrate uninterrupted occupation of another's land for a 10-year period, they can claim that land through adverse possession. When the Moccasin Flats families living on River Lot 5 were convinced to move to the Clearwater Drive road allowance, it interrupted their statutory period of occupation. For example, Pat Schott built his house 15 years earlier in 1962 and had squatters' rights and wouldn't leave unless they gave him land somewhere else. Steve Schott, his son, told us that, quote, "They tricked him. They said, well, we're going to develop a pad right over here alongside the banks, and we'll move your house there. Then we'll reskirt it, and then we'll build you a new front porch and a new shed." Finally, he agreed. So they brought a crane in, they lifted the house, sat it up there, blocked it. They were just about to skirt it in that when the city came in and put a stop work order on it because there was no permits. After that, he was illegal, a squatter, end quote. After moving his house, the town excluded Pat Schott from the relocation program. A letter from the town's lawyer, Michael Hill, corroborates this version of events. Once they had moved to the road allowance, the town was able to evict the families because adverse possession does not apply on Crown or municipal lands. In 1978, Northward and the town signed a development agreement to build Syncrude towers. The agreement included a condition that the town would evict the remaining Moccasin Flats families from the road allowance. The agreement said that once the families were evicted, Northward would purchase the 4.3-acre road allowance and build a marina. However, Northward never built the marina. This agreement on this slide, the agreement shows that the town and developers used infrastructure projects as a justification to evict people, and this is a story that we see in multiple places throughout Fort McMurray. The Syncrude Towers were a source of harassment for the Moccasin Flats families. During the construction phase, Northward built an 8-foot fence and a wall of snow to try to separate Syncrude Towers from Moccasin Flats. Alice Armit told Fort McMurray today that the construction workers threw pieces of cement and rebar down from the towers onto the roof of her house, causing damage. She was fed up with all the harassment, noise, and verbal abuse from the Syncrude Towers residents. Once the construction started on the towers, the town gave trailers to 7 families. They did not include the other families who had moved from River Lot 5. Helen Roy explained in a 2009 interview for the Mark of the Métis project how she had worked with the Métis local and the Nistawayu Friendship Center to ensure that the affected families got housing. She said then, quote, "Evelyn Webb and I, we worked for months, just the 2 of us, and we got Syncrude to donate trailers for every family that wanted it. A lot of them couldn't speak good English, so Tsitsi Armit would come with us, and she would be interpreter. People didn't want natives around, let alone to donate to them. So we just got the basics, but enough to get them going, and that was an accomplishment." Before they got the trailers, however, the town made the relocated families sign quit claims, which is on the slide here, that forfeited their squatters' rights or occupancy rights to Moccasin Flats. The town retained ownership of the land and the relocation trailers. This meant that when the relocated families died or left the trailers, the municipality took the property back. So we argued that the relocation program was a delayed eviction. The relocated families had to sign away their rights and did not own the land or the trailers that they moved to. The evicted families felt that they did not have a choice but to leave. The fact that the Métis Association and Friendship Center worked with the Moccasin Flats families to get these trailers does not suggest that the families condoned the eviction. The decision that the families faced was a trailer or nothing. While the relocation program was being completed, the town board voted to evict the remaining residents. Mayor Ted Mason and town clerk Gerald Brussiers instructed Brownlee Fryatt LLP to commence evictions proceedings against Pat Schott, Ben Powder, and Ron Curie, the people who still remained at Moccasin Flats. Ted Mason wrote to the 3 elders on December 11th, 1978, quote, "The town has made a commitment to clear the Snai area of occupants. In view of the foregoing, I would very much appreciate if you could make arrangements to move as soon as possible." 3 years later, the last remaining families were forced to leave. On May 14th, 1981, Sheriff John Easton and bylaw officer Brian Irvine evicted the Schott family and confiscated a trailer and mobile home belonging to the Powders and the Curries. During the eviction, Pat Schott supposedly pushed a bylaw officer, Brian Irvine, who was removing his possessions from his house. The police arrested Pat Schott. With Schott in jail, the town bulldozed his house. Pat Schott told Fort McMurray today, quote, "I was held hostage while they destroyed my home. I said, give me a place to stay where I own the property and you can't kick me out. They never came back. Why should I have moved? If I had, I would have signed away whatever claims I had on this land. Then where would I be? Right back where I was before, without land and living in a place where the city could kick me out on 30 days' notice." The evictions also triggered protests in the community. Joe Blind, the Métis Association vice president at the time, said at the protest, quote, "It wasn't just a particular group of people who made this country, it was all of us. We just want you, the mayor, and others gathered here to know that we want to be treated like the rest of you. No man should have the right to take another man's land away, especially if it is his home. And that's the issue here. A man's home was destroyed yesterday." So as I discussed earlier, Moccasin Flats was a homeland for all the families that lived there. Being evicted from this home had cultural and socioeconomic impacts for the evicted family, as well as being a source of intergenerational trauma for the families and the broader community. First, the evictions socially fragmented the community. One elder told us, quote, "Everybody knew each other. Once the homes were taken away, well, we moved here and others moved there. Everybody separated." So the evicted families scattered to places like Edmonton, Anzac, Fort Mackay, to the relocation trailers, or outside of downtown Fort McMurray. Relationships to the land were also disrupted. An elder shared that it impacted, quote, my mom the most because of her way of life. That all got affected when you move up to Beacon Hill, because you can't even start a fire in your backyard. So it was like 2/3 of her life were taken away when that happened. Moving away from a place where individuals and family feel at home, where they can freely maintain a traditional way of life, had significant impacts on sense of identity, livelihood, and well-being. These events are also felt intergenerationally. A next-generation Métis woman explained that, quote, intergenerational effects include disconnection to land as well as never having time or healthy resources to heal. I always imagine what it would be like to be able to feel part of a land base with roots and a community of family. I would love to move back and feel a sense of community, but the cost of living and lack of land base leaves me wondering if I will ever return. The evictions also affected housing insecurity and family finances. Elders described how families who were provided trailers were forced to live in what were relatively low standard housing compared to other housings being developed in Fort McMurray at the time. The trailers also remained property of the municipality. Families could not sell their trailer if they wanted to move, and trailers were only granted to the family until the signatory of the agreements passed away. The property therefore could not be transferred to the descendants of the Moccasin Flats residents. The result was insecure housing and an inability to make changes to or uphold the property in a meaningful way. Property taxes on the trailers and other housing in Fort McMurray increased exponentially since the 1970s. Individuals had to pay more for housing or were forced to move out of town. Those families who did not find homes ended up homeless. One elder explained, quote, after they kicked us out, we went through real hard times, you know. We struggled to find another place, and we slept in McDonald Island sometimes. We asked interview participants what avenues to reconciliation would look like for the Moccasin Flats evictions. We came up with the following list, and I won't go into it in too much detail for time, but just to note that these avenues to reconciliation are preliminary, and they require more consultation with the evicted families and their descendants, as well as the Métis community and other communities in the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. So to close, I'd like to again thank the elders and community members that we spoke to for this project, as well as Lucas Punko, a student at the U of A, who was an invaluable research assistant, the regional municipality for providing us archival documents, and the McMurray Métis board leadership and staff. So thank you for your attention, and thanks for the opportunity to share today.
All right, so thank you very much to all of you for sharing your research and your stories, and to our elders who are here to and that contributed to that work. Can't help but feel a little heavy in my heart after hearing those stories. So we do have time for some questions, and we'll also welcome questions from our online stream as well as the other rooms. And here we have the lady that was here earlier. So thank you for coming back to the mic. What's your question?
It was just some comments about the Saint-Paul-des-Métis colony. When the school was burnt, there was a girl that died in the fire, and her brother actually lit the fire. He burnt the school. So I think people need to know the whole of it and why those children were there. I believe they were orphans. So you have to look at the whole of the context. When you talk about squatters, what about all the Ukrainians and the Romanians that came in and were squatting near Joly Crossing, which isn't very far from there? You know, that was just as bad. They just came and they squatted, and then all of a sudden they wanted the land, and they pushed the others out. The other comment I had was, with Father MacDemel, he was a Benedictine priest. He was not an oblate. He was Benedictine, and he came from Scotland, from the Hebrides. And he came here to Clondonald. If anybody knows the history of Clondonald, how did he end up there with this colony from the Hebrides? And nobody talks about that. He came because of the railway company, not the church. As in many communities, it was the railway company that came and did a lot of the disruption. It was schemes by the railway. Yeah, so don't forget about things like that. Oh, and then you talk about the people of Saint-Paul-des-Métis. They weren't used to farming. Put yourself back in that time period. Now fast forward to today, what's happening with all our farmland? It's becoming corporate owned. Where are we going to be tomorrow if we don't start looking after ourselves now? That the corporate world has taken over all our farmland. And I think we need to start thinking about that. That's all.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your comments. Natalie, would you like to respond?
Well, I tend to agree that history in general is complicated because there's all kinds of different factors, but I was asked to look specifically at this issue of Saint-Paul-des-Métis as an alternative to Scrip and the impact it had on the community that was there. But I tend to agree with you. There's other elements there with other people that are coming in, like the Ukrainians, and and so it complicates the story ultimately, and the fact that it was not just people like Terrien and Lacombe, that there were other orders that were in the area. But I think a comprehensive history of St. Paul has not really been written, like of the larger region too. And so there's much more that needs to be done. And by just preparing this, I realized that there's so much that we could start looking at, like homestead files, and also having looking at all the Scrip applications in the area, and trying to build the type of history that Ellis and others have shown us today. So, but it takes a long time to do that, and that's my hope, that with the Rupert's Land Center for Métis Research, we can do this type of research and use, our students in order to look at all the different facets of a specific history of a specific region. So thank you very much for your comments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gentleman in the blue.
It's me again. So back when all this, the removal of the so-called squatters was happening, I was there, and I spoke to the last couple families that were being evicted. And the two gentlemen that I spoke with, they were, literally not bawling, but they had tears coming down their eyes while this was happening. And I really, really wished that I was able to help. And I knew the mayor at the time, and he never mentioned anything about it. And I know the hardships that the people were going through at Moccasin's Flats, because I used to drink with them. And when they shed tears, they weren't under the influence. And I wished, to this day as I speak, that I wished I could fix that. But it's a system that we have to fight, or it's a system that we're up against. And as mentioned this morning, the system that we're up against is through fraud. And I don't know, you can't fight fire with fire. And my comment here as I stand is, this is our place. And again, going back to the people who were being evicted, I sat with them for hours, just so helpless. And I wasn't even a part of that organization. I was just there, someone who wanted to be friends, because I grew up with elders, and I sat with them. And, I mean, it's hard watching 60-year-olds, 65-year-olds, my age, with tears going down their eyes. It's a sad history. And I guess that's why we're wild. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Is there, I see an online question at the back or from the other room?
Yeah, this is from Rachel for Natalie. What was the date on Lacomb's advertisements inviting families to Saint-Paul-des-Métis? As she frantically looks through her notes.
The one that I found was October 7th, 1896. It was in the Northwest Review. But I know that he published those like in all kinds of different newspapers, and there are some advertisement that we see in 3 languages, Cree, French, and English, around that same time. So I'm sure that if you were looking at different newspapers of the time, you would find these advertising.
Okay. Thank you. So it seems like there's no further questions. Last chance. No? All right. For right now, we would like to call up all the presenters from the day. So we'll just have these 3 stay here. So that would be our elder Norma Spicer, who opened us up with prayer this morning. If you wouldn't mind coming up, I'm going to ask Jen Roster and maybe even Leah, if you don't mind, to come and help. And we have a little something for you for speaking today. President Audrey Poitras. Jason Madden has left the building, but maybe Zach, do you want to come and receive that on his behalf? No pressure. I'm embarrassed you. Dr. Frank Tuff, he's coming back, he said. Dr. Keisha Supernant, Dr. Alice Glaze, and Leah is handing out but also receiving her own. And yeah, that's everybody for today. So let's give them all a big round of applause for today. Thank you. Here you go.
It's nice to do it as a group like this, because then people...
No? Do you want a picture? Yeah. And I think we'll ask them all to come here and we'll take a picture. I don't know who our media person is officially. Is that you? Oh, here she is. Our official. But feel free yourselves to take a photo as well. She left the building. Now she's back. Sure. Yeah, where would you like them? Oh, okay. 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 Oh, no, you don't need to take my picture. Okay, and I'm just going to invite, thank you. I'm going to invite Dr. Nathalie Kermoal back up here so she can let us know the rest of the evening. I believe there's a standing reception, a dinner, some fiddling, perhaps some beverages coming up. So I'll just have her come up and confirm those things. Did you want to just explain? staying the rest of the night? I'm like, I kind of said what I was. Okay.
Okay, so you worked very hard all day, like sitting down and listening to us. So now it's time for a little something, a little something. That's so there's a reception outside, and there's a bit of food, and there's some beverages. Some are more alcohol oriented than others, but it's up to you, you know, like, but everybody's welcome to, and then continue talking to each other and sharing stories. Thank you. Have a fantastic evening.